This is your Wall Street wake-up call. Global stocks rising for the second straight day after deep losses following last week's Brexit vote. For more, I'm joined now by David Leibowitz, the global market strategist at JP Morgan Asset Management. So David, help us make sense of the gains here. I mean, what is there to celebrate? We haven't even scratched the surface in terms of the political fallout from this Brexit, which could be a nasty two-year process.
Well, I think you make a good point. It could be a nasty two-year process. And obviously you saw markets react very sharply at the end of last week and the beginning of this week. But I think now the market's realizing that we don't really know how this is going to play out. And so the market's taking a step back to an extent and saying, okay, let's wait until we have more details before we go into full-on sell-off mode.
Okay, but the key question now, right, is whether Brexit is more of a domestic issue for the UK or a global one. Where do you stand on that?
So our view is that it's a domestic issue. This really matters for the UK and for Europe. Both economies are going to slow down as a result of the event. The US, generally speaking, we should be fine. We export a very small percentage of our GDP to the UK. The financial ties are there. There's an element of contagion, but from an economic standpoint, we don't really think that there's going to be too much of an effect.
Just in terms of the markets, though, I mean, we're seeing the pound rally a little bit today against the dollar. Do you think we're going to sort of fall into this pattern where the markets follow the pound just like the markets followed oil in the beginning of this year and the end of last year?
I think the market will be following the pound, but I actually think the dollar is still really what's key here. The dollar, too much dollar strength, that's going to keep the Fed on the sidelines. That's going to determine what happens in emerging markets. So we're much more concerned with the dollar relative to all the other currencies rather than thinking the pound is going to drive the bus.
And have you changed your S&P 500 targets for this year now that we've had this Brexit vote?
We still think that stocks can be mildly positive for the year, but we're getting to a point where we really need to see the micro turnaround. We need to see earnings growth come back. My biggest concern is that everybody's been talking about how fewer headwinds from the dollar, fewer headwinds from oil. We should see profit growth rebound in the second half. Now the dollar's strengthening. Are we just setting ourselves up for more lackluster profit growth? Because that's what's going to keep a lid on stocks, in our opinion.
All right, so we're sort of slightly above 2,000, the S&P 500, right? 2030 or around there. Where do you think it's going by year end?
So we think, mid-single digits, so, maybe a little bit above 2,100, but I think that right now we're in a range-bound market. We need to see a clear catalyst in order to break to the upside, and to me, that catalyst has to be earnings.
Okay, and your advice to investors right now, I mean, is this more of a cash environment in your view?
So I think this is why you stay balanced. This is why you hold some risk assets and some high quality assets. Treasuries have obviously done very well over the past few days, but we've seen stocks rebound. So I don't think that you shun risk assets. We still see some upside there, but I think that this is a market where it's more important than ever for investors to remain diversified.
And just very quickly, do you think Brexit will dominate the markets for the rest of the year, or will there be other issues like the Fed, oil, or China that sort of come into play?
I think the Fed and China are going to come into play. You've seen some yuan weakness relative to the dollar. Nobody's really panicking about it yet, but if it starts to lead to capital outflows, that would obviously be a concern. And then obviously how this all ties back to the Fed. Will they raise rates this year? If you look on Bloomberg, they're talking about rate cuts if you look at the futures market. So I think that the jury is out on the Federal Reserve from where we sit.
Yeah, the Fed is really in a corner. We'll be watching. All right, David Leibowitz from JP Morgan Asset Management. David, thank you.
Thanks.
I'm Scott Gamm, and you're watching The Street.